So let's begin with a very basic question related to your work. What is autocratic legalism?
Well, autocratic legalism is what you find when you have leaders who are trying to pretend to be Democrats and trying to pretend to do everything legally, but the effect of all the laws that they write and that they pass is to consolidate power in the hands of fewer and fewer people and to ensure that power never leaves their hands. So the goal is autocratic capture and the method is law.
And how do they differ from autocrats we've learned about at school?
Well, the autocrats you've learned about at school are autocrats who are not afraid to use force to seize power. So everybody knows you're in trouble when there are tanks in the streets, and everybody knows that you're in trouble if there's a military coup, or if suddenly the radio starts playing somber music, and the next thing you know, the prime minister is arrested. So all of those things we all know to recognize as danger signals. That's 20th century authoritarianism in a nutshell.
Right.
Now, what's happening in the 21st century is something very different. So almost all the countries where you see democracy declining or where democracy has been shut down, the path is a very different one. Instead, you find populist leaders getting elected, usually with some kind of rhetoric of change, and then they use the law to enact their program. So what could be wrong with that? It looks like normal democratic change. What distinguishes normal democratic change from autocratic legalism is the substance of those changes. So when the substance of the changes has the effect of removing all the constraints on the power of the chief executive or the power of the governing party, and the goal of those changes is to entrench them in power forever, then you've got autocratic legalism. But of course, it will look like ordinary democratic procedure for a long time. So the fact that they're elected and passing laws doesn't tell you that that everything is fine. You have to look at the substance of the laws.
And what do you find is the most common misconception about these types of leaders? What do people tend to not understand about them? People like Orban or Kaczynski or Trump and others.
Well, because they know that they can say, we were elected, therefore we're allowed to do this. We're elected, we pass laws. That's what elections are supposed to produce.
Right.
It kind of makes people speechless because they don't have a vocabulary for criticizing what's wrong or really understanding what's at stake, and it's true. A government that's elected does have the right to change laws. That's exactly what it means to have a democracy.
Right.
Okay. But there have to be limits on that process. And the limits are that you can't change the rules of the game. You can only play the game. Right. And when you start changing the rules of the game, by which I mean who's allowed to say that what the government is doing is constitutional, or who's allowed to check that what the government has done is actually following the proper procedures or the proper laws. Like you need neutral referees, the rules of the game, to say that the current government is still playing within the rules.
Yeah.
Once the current government starts to change the rules of the game, then you are in trouble if you've got a government that is really doing it in order to disarm the opposition forever, and that's their goal. So this is the thing. So it's not a democracy if you only have one election. It's only a democracy if you can get to the next election, which can still be free and fair. Right? So democracy is not about the last election, it's about the next one. And when you have a government trying to change as many laws and to remove as many checks on executive power as this government is doing, then this is a danger signal about whether you will get to the next election for, that where you can change the leadership if in fact people don't want this.
Yeah. But this is really their argument in Israel as well. They keep saying we got 64 seats in the Knesset, and we've got the mandate to do whatever we wish to do, what we were elected for. Yeah. So is this the kind of argument you hear in Hungary, right, Poland, and Poland too?
Absolutely, everywhere, and also in the U.S. Trump was, I'm elected, I can do whatever, right? So the point is that governments are elected within a framework that ensures that free and fair elections will continue.
Yeah.
That ensures that there can be rotation of power. So therefore, there has to be an opposition. There has to be an open media so that people can see what governments are doing. There has to have to be election rules that are not rigged so that one party always wins.
Yeah.
There's a set of things that means. And those rules cannot be changed by one government. You know, they can only be changed if you get agreement across the political spectrum to change the rules of the game, right? The rules of the game need a consensus from all the major political forces. If you have one party or one coalition that is changing the rules to marginalize everybody else, then you are no longer in a democracy, even if that one government was elected, right? So what the autocrats want to do is to say, look back, in that last election, I won fair and square. And what any constitutional Democrat should say is, yeah, but what about the next election? We're only a democracy if we can continue to have free and fair elections in which the rotation of power is possible.
Yeah.
So the autocrats look to the past and the Democrats have to look to the future.
One of the most instructive pieces of research I think you've produced is this 8 steps taken by the new autocrats, a script that most of them follow once they're in power. Could you please walk us through these 8 typical steps?
Yeah. So one thing to know about the 8 steps is they don't always exactly happen in this order, but usually there's a government that runs through the 8 steps before the next election. Okay. So the first is that the autocrats gain legitimacy by winning elections. So this is the whole point. It's not a coup. It's an election. And they often take advantage of weaknesses or malformations, sort of defects in the prior election system. And in Israel, it's always a million small parties, coalitions are cobbled together. This has been an issue. In fact, Israel's primary check on executive power over the decades has been unstable coalitions, right? So when you get a coalition like the current one, where everyone has their first priority that the others are willing to go along with, this is probably the most stable coalition that Israel has had, and it's a fluke. That's the thing. So winning elections that are free and fair the first time. And then again, they shovel through laws through the parliament, and the substance of those laws is to remove whatever checks there are on executive power. And again, every system's different, so it depends on where those checks are. You know, in Israel, it happens that it's primarily the court system, because there's no upper chamber, there's no, separate, there's just not a whole lot of separate institutions that provide checks on executive power. So that they're going to go after the checks on executive power. In order to do that, they have to make the parliament, they have to capture it, or they have to bypass it. So in this case, when you have a parliamentary system like in Israel, the government is guaranteed its majority in the Knesset. So the system captures the parliament for you. In cases, though, you might find that there are some cases where the parliament won't go along with some of the more extreme cases. So there you find governing by decree. So whatever powers the executive has to issue executive orders, decrees or something, you'll see that being used if the parliament doesn't go along. Okay, then capturing the court. So this has been the headline signature, event of the current Israeli government, but you see this elsewhere too, court reform. So you often say, the judges are too political, or the judges are not political enough, or the judges were appointed in a different time and place for some other reason. Step 4 is capturing the courts, because again, the courts are usually the referees. Is this law constitutional? Was it within the power of the executive to issue that decree? So you need to neutralize the courts so they don't tell the executive no anymore. Okay, and then there'll be certain key institutions where the prime minister or the president needs to make sure their loyalists are in charge. These are all what I think of as the gateway institutions. So the public prosecutor, very helpful to capture whoever it is that can bring charges against people in the opposition, and more crucially even refrain from bringing charges against anyone on their own side.
Especially if you're corrupt yourself.
Especially if you're corrupt yourself, exactly. So the public prosecutor is really crucial. Having your people in the judicial selection committee ensures your continuing capture of the court.
Yeah.
capturing the election administration, right? So that by the time of the next election, if there's any problem, your people in those offices will resolve them all in your favor, right? So
Yeah.
all of these offices, it might also be crucial, depending on the government, to capture the military, to capture the
Mm.
state audit office, if they can detect, funny business going on with the budget. Whatever controlling institutions you have, you want your people in charge of them.
Yeah.
So that's also crucial appointments.
Mm-hmm.
Harnessing the media as an echo chamber is another thing. So again, the crucial thing is to make sure the public doesn't hear what the opposition is saying.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that by either regulation. So in a case like Hungary, they passed a law that said the news must be fair and balanced, which is the
Mm.
slogan actually of Fox News in the United States. And they put it in the law in Hungary with no sense of irony. And then they created a media council in charge of deciding what was fair and balanced. And what fair and balanced meant was that you always reported the government's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you'd get fined, bankrupting fines, if, you were a media outlet and you didn't report what the government's view was on everything. So
Mm-hmm.
you can do it that way through regulation. In some countries, oligarchs that are close to the administration buy up all the opposition media.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a public media and you've now got, people in the government who are controlling the public media, they fire all the real journalists and hire all their own people. So getting the
Sounds very
media to,
familiar.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So getting the
Mm-hmm.
media to constantly sing from the government's song sheet is really crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And then going after civil society and opposition parties. Now,
Yeah.
this can happen in a lot of different ways. So it can happen by arresting people. That tends to be controversial because that looks like a violation of human rights. And what's interesting about these governments is they try not to engage in mass human rights violations. This
Mm.
is another big difference between the current autocrats and the 20th century ones. 20th century ones specialize, in mass human rights violations.
Yeah.
The current ones try very hard to avoid all those tactics that look bad on camera, or that, jailing people for nothing in particular is not a good look. So instead, you find things like libel cases,
Mm.
defamation cases. In Hungary, they made it a crime to, quote, defame the Hungarian nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly it's not a criminal case, but it's a civil case, and it goes on forever, and it ties people up in knots, and it makes the opposition figures not want to say much because then they get sued, right? And so,
Yeah.
so it can be lawsuits. It can be, in some cases, the opposition, the civil sector gets state funding.
Mm-hmm.
So you cut the state funding. In
Mm-hmm.
some cases, or civil society, this is an issue in Israel, civil society gets foreign funding.
Yeah.
So you go after the foreign funding, or you
You
brand them
tax
as
it
foreign
differently.
agents. Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So whatever can harass civil society and keep
Mm-hmm.
it off, wrong-footed, make it, spend full time defending itself as opposed to going after the government, and then trying to hit the opposition parties, defunding them between elections, suddenly increasing the number of signatures they have to get somebody onto the ballot. There's a whole bunch of harassing things that can be
Mm-hmm.
done. And then before this government is up for election the next time, rewrite the election laws, right?
Mm-hmm. And
So that the opposition,
that's a crucial
yeah,
step, right?
it's a crucial step. And that's really when you've lost it. Now, you can get through half of this maybe in a first term.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's a second election in which the government is reelected, because oftentimes these governments will do things like suddenly, hand out lots of money to all their supporters before the election to make sure that they've got their votes, for example.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
happened in Poland, that happened in Hungary. But rewriting the election laws in particular is the clear sign that you don't have a democracy anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
those tend to be the steps. They sort of happen in this order, but they don't have to happen in this order. But all
Mm-hmm.
of those are danger signals. And the more of them you've got, the more dangerous it is.
What would be your message to the people attending the conference now, people who are deeply engaged in the fight for Israel democracy and against the so-called reform? What would be, the core message you'd like to send them?
Well, the core message is stay on the streets, keep
Mm-hmm.
protesting, keep being visible, because only when you've got a really mobilized population can you overcome a government which has as few checks on its power as the Israeli government has? And then, the first stage is just preventing this reform from going through.
Yeah.
The second stage is getting to an election so that you can change governments. The third thing is thinking about the structure of the Israeli system, because a unicameral parliamentary system with courts as the only check is exactly what Hungary had. It's the most vulnerable form of government because the checks are so small. I mean, it's just one institution. The laws that can change that are, easily within the reach of any Knesset, because the Constitution can be amended by a single majority, a simple majority. So thinking about making the system more complicated, putting more checkpoints in so that this can't happen again, is going to be crucial, I think, for thinking about the future of Israeli democracy.
As far as you know, is the Israeli case now something that international observers are looking at in order to see whether these kinds of regime coups are actually reversible, stoppable?
Yeah, well, the whole world is watching, right? I mean, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, a flawed democracy, but it's still a democracy. And it would be disastrous for the world as well as disastrous for Israel if democracy fails. So all eyes are on Israel for that reason. Also, all eyes are on Israel because this is one of these cases where as soon as this government started down the autocratic path, hundreds of thousands of people went to the streets. That's kind of a model for how other governments might respond, or how other, civic sector organizations might respond if they get a government that's like this, which is happening over and over again in different places. So Israel's a model for the world, and both in a good way and in a bad way, I'm afraid, right now. Bad way because no government should do this to its democracy, and in a good way because the response has been remarkable. And so you can't stop now.
We're not
I'm
going to, I
afraid.
promise.
Okay, good. Please keep going.
Yeah.
Democracy is worth it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Shapley, for being with us and sharing your knowledge and experience with us.
Well,
we
thank
deeply
you.
appreciate
And
it.
I'm so sorry my experience is relevant to what you're going through, but thank you for the opportunity to talk about it anyway.
Thank you very much.